I walked into the graduation party with my kids, both of them dressed in the matching outfits I'd ironed at 6 that morning. My son Milo clutching a card he'd made himself for his cousin Tabitha, my daughter June holding a wrapped gift I'd budgeted for over 3 paychecks. I'd spent the drive over rehearsing small talk in my head, the kind of harmless, careful conversation I'd need to have with relatives I hadn't seen since the divorce. How's work? The kids are getting so big. Can you believe Tabitha's already graduating? The verbal equivalent of tiptoeing across a floor I already knew had weak boards in it. Getting to that doorway had taken more than I think anyone in that backyard understood. It had taken 3 days of deciding whether to come at all, an evening spent staring at Tabitha's text, "So excited if you guys can make it." Wondering whether you guys extended past politeness into actual welcome. It had taken finding someone to cover my Saturday shift at the pharmacy, since Saturdays were usually mine and I couldn't afford to just not show up without losing pay I needed. It had taken Milo, 7 years old and endlessly earnest, spending an entire evening at our kitchen table with markers and construction paper, tongue between his teeth in concentration, making a card for a cousin 14 years older than him because he decided, on his own, that a store-bought card didn't feel like enough for someone graduating high school. He'd drawn a cap and gown on the front, misspelled congratulations in glitter glue, and asked me for separate times in the car if I thought Tabitha would like it. I told him yes each time, meaning it because I needed to believe it as much as he did. June, at 10, had been quieter about the whole thing, old enough now to have absorbed more of the family tension than I wished she had. She hadn't asked whether people would be happy to see us. She'd just picked out the gift, a graduation-themed photo frame she'd chosen specifically because Tabitha had once complimented June's own artwork at a holiday gathering years ago, a small kindness June had apparently filed away and never forgotten. I'd let her wrap it herself, badly, corners folded in on themselves, because I wanted at least one part of that day to be something the kids had built entirely without my anxiety layered over it. The 2 years since my divorce had reshaped the family in ways I was still learning the contours of. My ex-husband, Grant, had always been the easier one to love in front of a crowd, quick with a joke, generous with compliments, the kind of person who remembered your birthday and made you feel, in the 15 minutes he gave you at a party, like the most interesting person in the room. What most of my extended family hadn't seen, because he'd never let them see it, was the version of him that existed inside our house after the door closed, the slow erosion of things I'd once been sure of, the years of feeling smaller in my own home until finally, the year Milo turned 5, I couldn't make myself stay small any longer. The divorce had been ugly, the custody battle uglier, and somewhere in the process of lawyers and mediators and Milo asking why Daddy didn't live with us anymore, the wider family had sorted itself into camps the way families do when they don't actually know the full truth of a marriage and have to guess at it from the outside. Grant was better at the guessing game than I was. He'd always been better at being liked than I was, and in the aftermath of the divorce, that skill had paid off exactly the way it always had. Cousins who called him for advice, aunts who still sent him a Christmas card, my own brother Desmond, who'd golfed with Grant for years before any of this happened and apparently hadn't found a reason yet to stop. I hadn't expected warmth walking up that driveway. I want to be honest about that. I'd steeled myself for something cooler than the family gatherings of my childhood, some careful distance from people who weren't sure whose side they were supposed to be on and had decided neutrality was safest. I'd told myself in the car that I could handle cool. What I hadn't prepared myself for, what no amount of rehearsing small talk in my head could have readied me for, was for it to be Desmond, my own brother, the person I'd shared a childhood bedroom with for 6 years before he got his own room, standing in the doorway between me and a backyard full of family, delivering something so much sharper than mere coolness. He met us right at the threshold, blocking the view into the yard just slightly, in a way that felt less like an accident of positioning and more like something he'd half-planned, standing there with a beer already in hand though it was barely 2 in the afternoon. I opened my mouth to say the thing I'd practiced, congratulations, or something about how big Tabitha had gotten, some soft opening volley meant to ease us both into the awkwardness of the day, and before I could get the first word out, he looked at the kids, looked at me, and said it. "Why did you even come? You know none of us actually expected you to show." I stood there for a second, feeling the words land somewhere low in my chest, a physical sensation, almost like something dropping through me and settling in my stomach. Behind him, past his shoulder, I could see the backyard. Strings of graduation banners, a table crowded with food, cousins and aunts and uncles scattered across lawn chairs. All of it visible for one unobstructed second before I registered that every face in that visible slice of yard had turned toward the doorway. Toward us. Clearly having heard him, clearly having heard exactly what he'd said, in the particular way sound carries across a quiet backyard on a still afternoon. Milo, beside me, still had his card half extended, the way he'd been holding it the entire walk up from the car, practicing in his head, I imagine, exactly how he'd present it to Tabitha. He looked up at his uncle, not yet understanding the words fully, but understanding, the way kids always understand faster than we give them credit for, that something had gone wrong in a moment that was supposed to be simple. June's hand found mine without either of us deciding to reach for the other, some old instinct between mother and daughter that needed no explanation. We came because Tabitha invited us, I said, and I was proud, afterward, of how steady I managed to keep my voice, for Milo's sake more than my own, because some part of me understood immediately that whatever happened in the next several minutes would become one of his memories of this family, and I didn't want that memory to include his mother crumbling on a doorstep. She texted me herself last week. Well, Desmond said, and I watched him glance back over his shoulder toward the yard, some quick, almost reflexive check of who exactly was witnessing this, the kind of look that told me he was at least somewhat aware of how this would read to an audience even as he kept going anyway. Maybe she didn't clear that with anyone. I looked past him then, scanning the yard for my mother, certain, in the particular blind faith you keep for your own parents even after everything, that she would step forward now, the way she always used to when Desmond and I fought as kids, inserting herself bodily between us until whatever argument we were having lost its steam simply from her presence. I found her near the drink table, a plastic cup in one hand, her eyes on us, unmistakably watching the entire exchange. She didn't move. Her expression gave away nothing I could read from that distance, and she made no move at all to close the space between us, no move to correct her son, no move to welcome her own daughter and grandchildren through a doorway they'd driven 40 minutes and spent 3 days deciding whether to walk through in the first place. I looked past Desmond into the yard, waiting for someone, anyone, to break the silence that had settled over that visible slice of the party, and it was Tabitha herself who finally moved. She came around the side of the food table at a near run, still in the yellow sundress she'd apparently changed into after the ceremony, her graduation cap tucked under one arm like she hadn't found anywhere to set it down yet. "You came," she said, and the relief in her voice was so genuine, so immediate, that something in my chest that had been clenched since Desmond opened his mouth finally loosened half a degree. She pushed past her father in the doorway, not quite shoving him but not quite gentle about it either, and crouched down in front of Milo before I could say anything else. "Is that for me?" Milo, still holding the card he'd made, nodded, suddenly shy in the way 7-year-olds get when a moment they've been rehearsing finally arrives and all the words they'd planned evaporate. Tabitha took the card from him with both hands, opened it right there on the doorstep, and I watched her read his glitter-glue congratulations, watched her face do something soft and real. "This is the best card I got today," she said, and I believed she meant it, because she pulled Milo into a hug before he even had a chance to respond, and over his head she looked up at her father with an expression I recognized instantly, having worn it myself at that age, the particular fury of a kid realizing an adult they loved had just done something ugly in front of people who mattered. "Dad," she said. "What did you just say to them?" Desmond's jaw tightened. "Tabitha, this isn't." "I heard you," she said, standing back up, one hand still resting on Milo's shoulder like she wanted to keep some physical claim on him, some assurance he was hers to welcome regardless of what her father had decided. "I heard exactly what you said. I invited them. I texted Aunt Corinne myself because I wanted them here." "I didn't know that," Desmond said, though something in his tone suggested he was backpedaling now, recalibrating in real time now that his daughter had made her allegiance clear in front of the same audience he'd performed his cruelty for. "Nobody told me you'd invited." "You didn't ask," Tabitha said. You just assumed, because it's easier for you to assume because you've spent 2 years acting like Aunt Corinne doesn't exist just because Uncle Grant still comes to your golf outings. I hadn't expected to be defended, and certainly not by a 17-year-old whose party I'd worried, the entire drive over, might not actually want us there. I felt my eyes go hot and blinked hard, because the last thing I wanted was to cry on that doorstep, in front of everyone, in front of my own children, giving Desmond the added satisfaction of having reduced me to tears on top of everything else. June, beside me, had gone very still, watching this unfold with the careful, quiet attention she brought to everything since the divorce, cataloging, I imagined, exactly which adults in this family could be trusted and which couldn't, filing Tabitha now firmly into the first category. My mother finally moved, crossing the yard toward the doorway, though her pace was unhurried in a way that told me this wasn't urgency so much as obligation, the sense that a scene was happening and someone matriarchal needed to be seen managing it. "Let's not do this in front of everyone," she said, arriving at Desmond's shoulder, her eyes flicking toward the assembled cousins and aunts still frankly staring from their lawn chairs. "Corinne, come in, sit down. Let's not make a whole thing out of this." Desmond made the whole thing, I said, and I was surprised by how level my own voice came out, given how much was moving underneath it. "I didn't ask to be humiliated at the door. I came because your granddaughter invited us." "Nobody's humiliating anybody," my mother said, in the tone she'd always used to smooth over Desmond's behavior throughout our childhood, the tone that had taught me, years before I had words for it, that keeping the peace mattered more in this family than acknowledging who'd actually caused the disturbance. Desmond didn't mean it like that. How else was I supposed to take it? I asked her directly because something in me, standing there with my children on either side of me, had finally run out of patience for the old script where I absorbed the discomfort so everyone else could stay comfortable. He asked me why I even came, in front of the whole yard. What other way is there to take that? My mother didn't answer that directly. She glanced at Desmond instead, some silent communication passing between them that I recognized from decades of watching them protect each other, and then she said, "Let's just go inside and have some cake. It's a happy day." It was, I realized in that moment, exactly the response I should have expected and somehow still hadn't fully braced myself for, not an apology, not even really an acknowledgement, just a redirect toward cake, toward normalcy, toward the fiction that nothing worth addressing had actually happened. Tabitha, still standing with her hand on Milo's shoulder, looked between her grandmother and her father with an expression of open disbelief. "Grandma." He literally just asked her why she came. On the doorstep. In front of everyone. "I know what he said, sweetheart," my mother replied, and something in the weary practicality of her tone told me this wasn't the first time she'd had to talk her way past one of Desmond's comments, that some long, familiar groove existed in her for exactly this kind of moment. "But we're not going to solve 2 years of family stuff on my back porch during your graduation party." "Then when?" Tabitha asked. "Because it's been 2 years and nobody's solved anything. They've just decided Aunt Corinne doesn't get invited to things anymore, and I'm the only one who apparently thought that was messed up enough to actually say something about." The silence that followed that felt different from the one Desmond's comment had created. Less shocked, more exposed, like something the whole family had quietly agreed not to look at directly, had just been dragged out into the yard in broad daylight by a 17-year-old in a yellow sundress. I looked at Desmond, who wouldn't quite meet my eyes anymore, his beer held loosely at his side, the confidence that had carried him through his opening line clearly draining out of him now that his own daughter had refused to let it stand unchallenged. I looked at my mother, still hoping, some small stubborn part of me, that she'd finally say the thing I'd needed her to say for 2 years, that I hadn't done anything to deserve being erased from these gatherings, that whatever camp people had chosen in the divorce didn't require punishing my children along with me.
She didn't say it.
Instead, she reached out and touched my arm, the gesture landing somewhere between comfort and management.
"Come on," she said.
"Let's get the kids some cake before it's all gone." I stood there a moment longer, feeling June's hand still in mine, feeling Milo pull slightly back from Tabitha's hug to look up at me, waiting, the way kids do, for some cue about what we were supposed to do next, stay and pretend the doorway hadn't happened, or turn around and walk back to the car with whatever dignity we could gather on the way. I looked down at Milo, still holding half of Tabitha's hug, and at June's steady, watchful face, and I understood that whatever I decided in the next few seconds would become part of how they remembered this family. If we walked away now, it would confirm something in Milo's 7-year-old heart that I didn't want confirmed, that showing up with a homemade card, with good intentions, with love carefully wrapped in construction paper, wasn't enough to earn a place at the table. But if we stayed and let my mother's redirect toward cake stand as the resolution, I'd be teaching both of them something worse, that when someone hurts you in front of a crowd, the correct response is to swallow it and reach for dessert. "We're going to stay," I said, mostly to Tabitha, though I said it loud enough that Desmond and my mother both heard it clearly. "Because you invited us, and because Milo made you a card he worked really hard on, and because I'm not going to let 2 years of other people's discomfort decide whether my kids get to know their cousin." I looked at Desmond directly then, for the first time letting the full weight of what I felt show on my face instead of smoothing it into something more palatable for the yard full of witnesses. "But I want to be very clear that what you said to me at that door was cruel, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't just because Mom wants cake first." Desmond's face flushed, some mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness moving across it. "I didn't mean—" "You did mean it," I said. "You meant it enough to say it loud, in front of everyone, before I'd even gotten a foot through the door. If you'd meant something gentler, you'd have said something gentler. Don't tell me what you meant when I watched you decide how to say it." He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him look toward our mother, an old childhood habit, checking whether she'd rescue him from this the way she always had, and I watched her, for the first time in longer than I could remember, not immediately step in to smooth it over for him. She just stood there, cup still in hand, looking between her 2 adult children like she was seeing the pattern clearly, maybe for the first time in years, or maybe just recognizing that this particular audience wasn't going to let her manage it away quietly this time. "Desmond," she said finally, quieter now, without the yard's worth of witnesses in mind, or at least without performing for them the way she had a moment before. "You need to apologize to your sister." It wasn't the full reckoning I'd wanted. She didn't ask why she'd let 2 years of exclusion happen in the first place, didn't examine her own part in choosing comfortable silence over uncomfortable honesty, but it was more than she'd offered in the previous several minutes, and given everything, I found myself grateful for even that much. Desmond looked at me, and something in his posture deflated slightly, the beer-fueled confidence of his opening line fully gone now. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was out of line. I've just—" He stopped, glanced at Tabitha, then back at me. "I've spent 2 years being angry on Grant's behalf without ever really asking you what actually happened. I took a side because he was easy to golf with and you weren't around to defend yourself, and that wasn't fair." It wasn't a complete apology. It didn't undo 2 years of Christmas cards that stopped coming, of invitations that quietly excluded us, of a family that had decided, without ever asking me directly, which version of the story to believe. But it was the first honest thing my brother had said to me since the divorce began, and standing there on that doorstep with my children watching, I decided it was enough to work with, even if it wasn't enough to fully forgive in that single moment. "Thank you," I said. "That's a start." Tabitha, still standing close to Milo, looked between the adults with the particular satisfaction of a teenager who has just watched justice get served, however imperfectly. "Okay," she said. "Now can we please go get cake? Because I actually am starving, and Milo's car deserves to sit somewhere nice instead of getting soggy in everyone's hands." The tension didn't dissolve entirely. Desmond spent much of the rest of the party keeping a careful, slightly sheepish distance from me, and my mother's attempts at conversation over the next hour carried an unmistakable current of wanting to move past the whole incident faster than I was ready to move past it. But something had shifted, cracked open in front of enough witnesses that it couldn't be quietly buried the way these things usually were in my family. Several cousins I hadn't spoken to in 2 years came to find me over the course of the afternoon, in the particular quiet, one-on-one way people approach you after they've witnessed something they didn't know how to react to in the moment. My cousin Priya found me by the dessert table and said, without much preamble, "I didn't know Desmond was still like that with you. I'm sorry we all just went along with it." My Aunt Vivian, who I'd always suspected privately disagreed with how the family had handled the divorce, but had never said so out loud, squeezed my arm on her way past and murmured, "Your kids are lovely. I'm glad you came." It wasn't a full family reckoning. Grant still golfed with Desmond, still got his Christmas card, still occupied a comfortable place in the family's collective mythology that I probably wasn't going to dislodge in a single afternoon, no matter how honest Desmond's half-apology had been. But watching Milo sit at the picnic table beside Tabitha, showing her, in exhaustive 7-year-old detail, exactly which glitter glue he'd used and why, and watching June slowly relax enough to laugh at something one of the younger cousins said, I understood that the afternoon had given my children something they hadn't had in 2 years, proof that showing up with love, even when you're not sure you want it, sometimes actually gets rewarded, even if the reward comes wrapped in an uncomfortable doorway moment first. Before we left that evening, Tabitha walked us to the car. Milo's card now tucked carefully into her bag alongside her other gifts. The wrapping paper June had folded imperfectly still intact on the photo frame she carried under one arm. "Thank you for coming," she said, and then, glancing back toward the house, added, "I'm sorry about my dad. That was really messed up." "You don't have to apologize for him," I told her. "You did the opposite of what he did. You made it right." She shrugged, the particular deflecting shrug of a teenager not quite ready to accept credit for something that had clearly cost her something to do. "I just didn't think it was fair," she said. "You're still my aunt. Milo and June are still my cousins. None of that changed just because you and Uncle Grant didn't work out." I hugged her before we left, and I meant it more than I'd meant almost any hug I'd given that entire difficult year, because somewhere in that 17-year-old's stubborn insistence on fairness, I'd gotten back something I hadn't realized I'd been grieving, the sense that at least one person in that family still saw my children and me as fully belonging to it, regardless of which side anyone else had quietly chosen. The drive home was quieter than the drive there had been. Milo, worn out from an afternoon of pool games and cake and the particular exhaustion of being fully, finally included, fell asleep somewhere around the second highway exit. June sat in the front seat beside me, old enough now that we'd started letting her ride up front on shorter drives, and after a long stretch of silence, she said, "Uncle Desmond was really mean at the door." "He was," I agreed, deciding this was a moment for honesty rather than the softened, protective explanations I sometimes reached for with her. "I was really upset. But Tabitha wasn't mean," June said. "And Grandma kind of made him say sorry, even though she didn't really want to." I glanced at her, surprised, as I often was, by how precisely she'd read a situation adults like to think was too complicated for a 10-year-old to fully track. "That's exactly right," I said. "So some people in the family are still nice," she said, half question, half something she was working out for herself, testing the shape of it out loud. "Even if some people aren't." "Yes," I said. "That's exactly it. Families aren't just one thing, all good or all bad. There are people in ours who love you and Milo without any conditions attached, and there are people who've made choices that haven't been fair to us. Both of those things are true at the same time, and it's okay to hold on to the people who show up for you and be honest about the ones who don't." She was quiet for a while after that, watching the highway lights slide past the window, and then she said, "I'm glad we went, even with the mean part at the beginning." "Me too," I told her, and I meant it, because for all the ugliness of that doorway moment, the afternoon had ended with something I hadn't expected to find there at all. Not a full repair of 2 broken years, but a genuine, unforced proof that not everyone in that family had quietly agreed to erase us, and that some of them, at least, were willing to say so out loud, even when it cost them something to do it.